An American Haunting is a 2005 horror film, and I was just scrolling through Stan, and I came across this film called An American Haunting. It was under 90 minutes. It looked like, just a fun and easy watch. It was based on a true story. I'm always a sucker for horror films, that are based on true story. I think there's some merit to them. And then, I'm also a casual fan of, possession and, haunting, type, horror films. I would call myself, a very, easygoing person. I would say that, the haunted house, subgenre is a genre that is very tropey. In terms of, like, once you've seen one, haunted house or one, paranormal, type film, you've really seen them all. Is each film just kind of follows on the same tropes and the same cliches, and there's they all just kind of blend in to each other. But at the same time, I suppose you can compare that to, like, every genre in horror. You can say, every slasher, feels like the next one. So yeah, at this point, I'm just rambling. But anyways, yeah, let's get into An American Haunting. This is based on the Bell Witch haunting, which I'm not too familiar with. I didn't do research, on this particular case. This was kind of my first introduction, and I'm sure it's a lot of your first introductions to this case. Yeah, other than that, don't watch this movie. Oh man, yeah, okay, yeah, just jumping right into the positives, because if you were to watch this movie, you would have already watched it. If you aren't going to watch it, you're going to listen to me talk about this movie. That's how this video is going to go down. So yeah, positives of An American Haunting. I think the period piece direction, which this is based in the 1800s, I really dig. I think the set design looks immaculate in this movie. Just going from, from like the way houses are built to the way, society functions, and the way people, work day to day, and the way they talk as well. They do a great job at bringing the 1800s to life here on a low budget. Which, when you watch this movie, you can tell that it is a low budget, independent film. But yeah, I think, everything looks really good, going from the way, houses look to, certain, objects that they have in frame, all of the little stuff, I thought they did, really, really well in here. And even going down to, like, characters' clothing. If you look at photos of the 1800s, it's pretty accurate in here, and I think it suits the characters that these actors are portraying. So as far as the actual time period, I think they did all of that, really, really perfect in here. It's spot on. Now, the next positive I'll give this movie is the music. It is very, overly dramatic. It is, the music, it fits the tone that this movie is going for. Which the tone that this movie is going for is, it is very ridiculous. This is a very ridiculous movie, and there's a lot of, sequences of the absurdity as this movie goes along. You have, there's actually probably one of the funniest scenes I have seen in a horror movie unintentionally, that is in this film, where, you have, your main, female lead here, who's the one, being possessed, who's the one, being haunted, and, and she's literally just being bitch slapped, for like a good, 2 minutes straight. And it's the funniest scene in this movie. Like, the spirit literally picks her up and just goes bang, 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 bang. It is the funniest shit. It's the funniest shit I've seen. A spirit knew what bitch slapping was back in the 1800s. Love it. And yeah, like all of the actual, possessing scenes in this film, it sucks for me to say it, but they're actually, more hilarious than they are, scary. This film isn't scary at all, this film, I would say it takes itself maybe a bit too seriously, like especially like, this story, the story at hand, is very serious. But then, just the way that the characters speak, I'm not going to say that's not how they did speak in the 1800s. I'm just saying it doesn't come across naturally. They're trying to speak like Shakespeare language in this film, and it just comes across as like hilarious, and like the way that the possession scenes are filmed, it's really awkward, because it would go from like I'll say okay cinematography to to like POV and like close-up shots, and and it just it doesn't look good. But saying that, however, I think the cinematography in this film, is actually quite good. I think there are some creative shots that they do, especially, towards, maybe the last 40 minutes, they're very CGI heavy shots, but there's like a shot where the spirit is going through like each room in the house, and like, each room kind of blends into each other, and it eventually ends on the outside, and it's all one continuous shot. At least it's edited to be one continuous shot, and it actually looks pretty good. It's creative, it's unique. It's probably like the one scene in this movie that makes it stand out. I think all of the acting in here, you have Sutherland in this movie as well. He's not too bad. I think all the acting, is pretty serviceable. I'm not going to say anyone is, great in this movie, but everybody, does what they're asked. I think at points, some of the emotion is very over the top, and then at other points in the film, the emotion is very tamed down in a scene that should be heightened. So, some of the performances are weird, but, I'd say for the most part, it's pretty good in here. Let's see, what else is there? There's one creepy scene actually, and it happens in like the first 25 minutes of the movie. You can honestly watch the first 25 minutes, or just scroll through the first 25 minutes if you want to know the scene I'm talking about. But there's a scene when our main female actress is on a swing, and and she's seeing this other woman or lady next to her on the swing, next to her, in other words, and and it constantly cuts back to, from her perspective, from reality's perspective, to her perspective, to reality's perspective, and it's really cool the way that scene is edited, and it's actually pretty effective. I think honestly the first 25 minutes had the best suspense, and any moment of tension was in the first 25 minutes of this movie. Could this movie have been longer? I really don't know. Because, like, This movie is less than 90 minutes, but the ending, I swear to fucking God, the ending drags on. If you want an ending that overly explains everything to you, this shit is it. Like this ending, it literally shows you scenes that played at the beginning of the movie, and it shows you scenes that happened in the middle of the movie. And there's not much extra context. We as the audience could have figured that out. It didn't need to have like an entire 20-minute goddamn sequence. This movie could have been an hour, and I may be a bit more kinder to it. But last 20 minutes is just overly long. I could not wait for it to end. This movie is under 90 minutes. To me, this movie felt like 2 hours. I swear to God, that ending just kept on dragging and dragging and dragging and just rehashing scenes we've seen. And like speaking of that as well, cliches, tropes. We've seen the trope of the door, creepily opening in the middle of the night. Okay, maybe that was effective the first time, but the other 98 times that they do it in this movie, it's not entertaining, it's not creepy anymore. And they use that tactic so goddamn much in this movie. And the ending as well, it's kind of cool, I guess, but like the ending, if you've seen the original Nightmare on Elm Street ending where, Nancy is in the car and the car has like, Freddy Krueger, colors on it. And basically, Freddy's now, possessed the car that the characters are in. That's basically the ending of this movie. Technically, the spirit's now following this little girl with David, the father now. And, yeah. We've seen all the shit that this movie has done, and in better haunting movies. I could watch, like literally any other haunting movie and get the same exact experience. I don't want to give this movie a hard time because I know how hard it is to make movies, and I know how hard directing is and acting is and writing and producing. But man, when you follow the exact cliche formula that this genre has been doing, honestly, for decades, prior to this point when this movie came out, you have a problem. Like this movie does, there's some creative camera angles. That's literally the only thing that will make this movie stand out. But its story, as far as the actual Bell Witch haunting, as far as that goes, I want to get into that quickly. As far as this goes, usually when you finish it based on true story, you immediately want to kind of Google it and be like, what's the actual, real life case behind it. I will be really honest, I don't give two shits. This movie is, this can be my quote. This could be my quote for this movie. This is the soap opera of haunting films. This movie is just so goddamn boring, filled with characters you don't care about, with a movie that's trying to be smarter than what it actually is. And fun fact, the movie's not smart at all. I don't want to trash on a movie. I don't do reviews to hate on films, but man, this film was bad. This film was boring. I checked out by the midpoint of it, and the next 40 minutes that followed was, it was a doozy, really. This film, yeah, man. I don't check my phone when I watch movies, but this film, I was actually, scrolling social media, man. Like, yeah, this movie really bored the fuck out of me. There's no intrigue like you know kind of where the movie is going to go, so there's really no surprises, there's no twist or story direction that kind of catches you off guard. The movie is exactly what you think it is. You know, a few positives aside, this is never going to be a movie I watch, and I hope this is a movie I never remember, because I can just watch, you know, 1,000 other haunting movies that are better than this, and that are better directed and better written and just better in every other way. At least there's other movies out there that are more entertaining than what this movie is. You know, I'm sure that, you know, the director of this, you know, is a talented guy, and I don't want to give him hate, because, you know, I think his direction in here, you know, is actually pretty good. But you know, whoever the writer is, you know, I don't know, just, you know, I understand, you know, that this is a genre, okay? This is, you know, the whole genre, you know, it's a genre that is hard to stand out, because, you know, at this point in 2025, you know, everything's been done, you know, I totally get that. But, you know, this is why writers are paid, you know, millions of dollars, you know, to think outside the box. You know, I'm sure there is a unique idea for a haunting film. You know, use your talents on other projects. You know, I'm sure for this time everybody was like, "Wow, this is an amazing script," but yeah, I don't know. Yeah, this movie wasn't really for me. So, yeah, you know, yeah, skip this one, guys. So, yeah, until next time, see you in the next video.